Les podcasts de la 46e édition de Cinéma du réel. Dans le cadre de la rétrospective consacrée à James Benning, discussion avec le cinéaste, animée par Antoine Thirion.
Bienvenue à cette discussion autour du travail de James Benning dans le cadre de la rétrospective que le Festival Cinéma du réel lui consacre cette année. Si vous avez assisté à certaines des séances de cette programmation, vous savez qu'on ne lui a pas demandé de faire des Q&A puisque ce serait un programme assez chargé pour lui, mais en revanche de lui demander des introductions. Maybe I can switch to English now because so that you, James, understand and you have a simultaneous translation that you can reach through the headset. So we didn't ask him to do any Q&As, but to do introductions, which he did very generously, and also trying as hard as he could not to give any kind of spoilers or to ruin the vision of the film. So we thought that this moment of exchange would be a moment that would be a general discussion, but also that would stand for a Q&A that didn't happen until now. You know also the principle of the retrospective, which was to pair two screenings together. So there was six what the festival called experiences comprised of two screenings and pairing two different films, sometimes three, generally comprising one film from the analog time and one film from more recent film from the digital time, because he switched to digital in 2009, I think. And this term of experience could be taken in its many senses, which is like an experience, a scientific one, when you want to study some phenomenon or you want to explore structure, an experience which would be like the sum of knowledges that you amass in a lifetime, and also an experience, like meaning something that you have to feel deeply for yourself, and I think that would apply for you as an audience in front of his films, but also for him when he's making them. So I thought this discussion could maybe just limit itself to 6 questions, one for each screening, but we could also do something else, and I will start by something else actually, which is to maybe ask him a little about the films that he shown yesterday, which was shown for the first time for an audience. I don't know if many of you have been able to see it. It's called Breathless. It was shown in Cinéma 1 yesterday evening. And during a lengthy introduction, James, you gave a few informations about the context in which you made it, the context of the place in which you shot it, and the fact that you wanted to make a remake of Godard's Breathless. You also said that it's actually the first time that you're remaking a film from the past, because you did it with Faces and Easy Rider around 10 years ago. So I wanted to ask you first, like a kind of general question on your relation to cinema, because you started yesterday by saying that you didn't like cinema, a little bit like a provocation, and then you said that Griffith has ruined cinema by bringing narrative into it, but also it was also right away to imply that you were interested in another kind of narrative, some kind of more natural, less conventional narrative or dramaturgy that happens through time and light. So I wanted to ask you first about this, your relation to cinema, maybe the experience of this shooting, your choice to remake the first Godard film, and in what way this film is also a film about cinema.
Well, I guess I kind of believe I don't like cinema, but I must like it somewhat. And So it's kind of a strange statement to make, and then to make films that are referring to cinema directly, and so I think of Breathless, this remake of Breathless, as part of this trilogy of films that I remade, and the first one was Faces, and when I remade Faces, I picked Faces because I think it's an important film as to how it affected cinema itself. And I myself don't like Faces at all, but mainly I don't like it because it was completed in 1969, and it's about people that are really still living in the 50s. There's no political context to that film at all. It's just a bunch of ugly drunk people, basically, that I had a hard time with. And but I also liked the style and the energy of that film. So when I remade it, it was kind of to understand the film maybe a little clearer for myself, but I also liked taking the title literally, that it's Faces, and I reconstructed the film by appropriating just the close-up of faces from Faces, and then I made a structure that the percentage of time Gina Rowland's face was on in the first scene would be the same as what I would collect, and then whatever the other actor would get that percentage of time. So it was a rebuilding of the time structure of Faces, but only using the close-ups, so then I would slow down those faces to stretch them to the screen time. So it became a film, a portrait film of the portrait of these ugly people that I saw in the film. Not necessarily physically ugly, but I felt that their lives were quite ugly to me. I mean, I can look at myself and call myself having an ugly life too, so I don't mean to be picking on Gina Rowlands when we all love her so much. And then I remade Easy Rider for the same reason, because I thought those two guys were so disgusting in that film. They're selfish drug dealers that want to move to Florida. Who can admire that? But I was interested in the locations that they shot, and so when I remade Easy Rider, I found all the original locations and just replaced each scene with what the locations looked like today. So it was really a landscape film that was structured to match the structure of the original film. And so then I decided to make a third self-reflexive cinema film just this past November, and I thought of the importance of Breathless and how much I hate that film. But I also know how important it was to cinema too. But I don't like a disgusting character like that. That's, you know, so it's my own kind of being outrageous to complain about great cinema films that represent these assholes. So when I remade Faceless, I didn't want to touch that character at all. So I thought, well, the only thing I'll do is I'll make the same format, 4:3, the same screen ratio, and I'll make the film the exact same length, 87 minutes that Breathless is. And then I would find a scene that would have relatively no narrative whatsoever in it, so it would be the opposite of creating a fictional narrative with a character that's kind of disgusting. And so that's what I want to do, but then I just wanted to shoot a tree, and we would see that the Earth is actually turning and the sun doesn't go around the Earth, but it looks like it does because we're turning. And then, so over this 87 minutes, you would see how the light would change because of the time of day that I'm shooting it at. But when I got there, I had a lens flare in my camera, so I couldn't start to film right away. So I set up the frame, and I had this yellow tree kind of in the middle of the frame. And then I was waiting for the sun or for the Earth to turn enough so the sun wouldn't be reflecting on my camera lens. And while I did that, a truck pulled in front of my tree, and I thought, oh shit. This isn't what I want. And then a guy got out and walked up, and he put a sign in the middle of the road, workers ahead. And I still hadn't started to film yet because I had this lens flare. And then he went back, and then the lens flare went away, and then I started the camera, and they started to trim the exact tree that I wanted to film. And I thought, oh, this is really kind of interesting. I'm trying to make a non-narrative film, and now I have a complete narrative going on that's destroying the film I want to make. And so they go ahead and trim that tree, and then they put the pieces of the tree into a wood chipper. So first you hear a chainsaw, and then you hear a wood chipper, and then one of the guys drives the truck away, and the other one stays there with a leaf blower, so you hear that. And then he walks in the direction that the truck went. And then it gets quiet, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. A narrative happened, and now it's gone. And then 10 minutes later, they start cutting another tree off screen, and you hear those same noises, but they're not quite as loud. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I filmed the narrative, and now I'm recording the same narrative only on sound. And so we're getting the echo of a narrative happening within a narrative. And then that finally ends. And then this huge truck, this is a small road that in the summertime is very busy with tourists, but in November there's nobody. And so the only vehicle that passed through the whole time was this huge truck, and it's the kind of truck Godard would love to put in his film. If you see that, reminded me of the big Shell truck in Weekend, this kind of fetishizing of this big truck. So I thought, oh, now it's becoming a Godard film, and I'm trying to make a film that isn't a Godard film. And then I'm close to the naval base that's nearby, and they have these state-of-the-art jet fighter planes that are doing maneuvers, and they start to lock on me as a target, and they're shooting at me literally just with, the video kind of game that they play when they practice. So they keep coming by and shooting. And then I thought, well, this is, again, Godard's interested in this kind of institutional violence and war and things like this. And then that finally goes away, and my film is over. So I experienced the narrative that was really dramatic, but I realized when it's put on film and at a distance, it's a very slow narrative that many people in the audience are going to get. It isn't breathless. It's a real breathless. It isn't a contrived narrative, but it's a real narrative that takes its own real time. So I think, oh, this is really a brilliant film. I call it to myself, I think that, and that it's a film that nobody will want to watch. That it's a conceptual film that it's nice to write about, but it's maybe difficult. So I was disappointed when yesterday I had another appointment, so I couldn't watch the film with the crowd because I wanted to see just how anxious people would get. Now, was that the question?
I mean, at least it's telling to people who haven't seen the film, the whole plot of the film.
And so for me, the film is highly narrative, and it's a really important narrative in my life. It's something I experienced, and I remember nervously watching it and waiting and all of this. So when I watch the film, it's a very strong narrative. But then for an audience to watch this, it's slow. It takes time for this all to happen. But
you mentioned that you wanted to be here in the audience and hear the audience reacting to the film, and we never talked about that. But I was wondering, like, if you liked in some way, like feeling how people can struggle, or maybe then like the experience of duration.
Mm-hmm. I never made films for an audience. I just made films for what I was interested in. I was hoping that there would be an audience. And when I made my first feature, 11 by 14, it was shown in Berlin, and about 2/3 of the audience left. And I was devastated because I thought this was kind of an entertaining film. And then 50 or 40 years later, the film was restored and showed in the same theater in the Dolphy Theater with a crowd of 550 people, and nobody left. So I thought, this is interesting that I create a particular kind of narrative that wasn't familiar, and then from showing over the years, I generated an audience that would kind of watch the film like I thought they would watch the film. But to this day, I hate to think about what an audience wants, because then we don't move the language forward. We don't add to the vocabulary of filmmaking if we try to study a film that's very successful and then use the techniques of that film and the structures of that film to guarantee another audience. And that's what a lot of commercial cinema does, that because they'll do part 1, part 2, part 3. So it's driven by an economy and an amount of money that's needed to make these films. I made Breathless for nothing. I had to spend some gas money, but I own my own equipment. I do all the work, so I don't have to answer to those needs of making profit or breaking even. Yeah.
Maybe if we can talk about the first experience, but you just mentioned 11 by 14, which was paired here with Roure, and the reason, I guess, for them to be paired is that they are both first features. Mm-hmm. 11 by 14 is the first feature on film, and Roure is the first feature on digital. And I was wondering if you could tell us about your relation to analog film and your decision to switch to HD at some point. Also, I asked you when you arrived here if you would ever, and I guess that's maybe lots of people who like your work, they are sort of want you to experience film again, and then you replied that you would never go back because of the inconveniences. And also I want to talk about that because that informed a little bit the films that you've chosen for this retrospective. And
well, I began making films in the early 70s, even shot some regular 8 film in the latter part of 1960s. So there wasn't, the film was the medium that one would record. It was a time-based medium, and that's what I liked. And of course, I was seduced, like a lot of filmmakers are, by the material film. And then I was aware of a number of artists that were making films about the material itself. So I bought into the whole kind of romance of the grain and all of that, and I still like that. But as my career advanced and the kind of films I made, I saw that the material film that I really needed was high grain, and that could replicate a truth in the frame rather than the romance of the grain. And so when finally digital came out, that to my understanding that it looked, I could make a good image with it. And at that same time, labs were giving worse and worse services. Projection was getting worse, so you'd spend 5 months getting a good print and you could ruin it in 2 weeks or 3 screenings. That was just too stressful for me. And then, so then I switched to digital. And then once I did that, I realized that this, and I still use the same camera that I bought in 2008 or 9, because it's just an HD camera and it isn't 4K, and so it doesn't mimic film, but it has its own personality also. Where when you get really high definition, it kind of scares me, the clarity of the image. So I'm very happy with that because I don't have to deal with labs, and I can make films since I own all my own equipment and I know how to take sound and mix sound and do color correction. I don't need any technicians anymore. So Breathless, like I said, I didn't spend any money except the gas money to get there. So it's really affords me opportunities that I could never have when I was relying on labs and all that cost. I had to make more money. So there's a real freedom with digital.
Also, before you switched to digital, you already had switched to like sound digitals before? Or?
I did but not. I was still cutting mag sound on a Steenbeck in 2003 or 4. So but then I did. There was a little time when I started to do sound on the computer, and that's kind of what led me into wanting to then try the image.
I was mentioning that maybe some of the films weren't there also because they are not restored, and the films you've chosen are both in like new DCP formats. But what is left from the analog period to be restored?
Well, there's quite a few films to restore yet. The whole California trilogy needs to be done. The really short films and optically printed films that I did in the early 70s, none of that's restored. We're doing, we just did 13 Lakes for this program. We're doing 10 Skies next. And then there's a number of other early features, like Him and Me hasn't been restored. I think we're about halfway only. It's costly.
Maybe the second pair of films, which is comprised of American Dreams, Lost and Found, and another film called John Krieg Exiting the Ford Corporation in 1971, which is actually showing tomorrow, so we are spoiling it a little, but I guess that's fine. What is the reason behind the pairing? I guess there is something about work and also where you come from, the working class.
Some of the pairing was done because of how long a film was. I had to fit them together that way. So I can't defend some of the pairing. Which two are together?
John Krieg and American Dreams.
Well, there is another reason for that. American Dreams was shot on an animation stand, so it has animation. I animated the text through the bottom and it's just a baseball card. So it has a look because it's shot on an animation stand. And then John Krieg is manipulated 8 seconds of film from a very early film of mine, Time and a Half. I took 8 seconds of the characters exiting a factory, and I slowed the 8 seconds down to the 40, or no, it's 71 minutes. And then there's, this could have been done on an optical printer, which is something I always wanted to do, but it would have been a huge amount of work. And now with digital, there's a kind of an art button you push, and it can frame blend, so you don't have to do copies of frames and then literally dissolve them into the next copy of a frame. You just push a button and it automatically does that. And I tried different settings on that particular art button, and I liked the way it would destroy the frame and then bring it back. So it's kind of a dancing of the image going in and out of recognizability. So it's a kind of playful film that one could think of as animation. So I put them together because of that.
And the fourth one is Four Corners and Readers, and it has to do with the reading or the presence of text, except the second one, you just read people's faces, you don't see...
Yeah, and it's both of them are are 4 sections of the film, so,
Right.
So it's kind of a simple pairing of totally different kind of films, though.
I wanted to touch upon this idea of solitude that you have linked your filmmaking with. You started with films that sometimes were collaborations, sometimes had actors, and it was much less solitary. And then at some point it became more about reflecting, and it's also something that the audience could feel, like what it is to stay 70 minutes in front of a still image. You feel, in some way you feel your solitude, even if you're surrounded by many people from the audience.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could reflect about that idea of solitude.
I'm trying to, I've always been interested in solitude, but not connecting it to cinema. And so when I started, I was and I had a limited view of what cinema could be. And because of that, a lot of my early films deal with some kind of experimentation with acting or narrative. And that has a whole set of values if you're dealing with people in the film and but I always, as a kid, I grew up in the 50s, and it was a time, at least in my city, where parents let the kids go out the front door in the morning, and as long as you were home by 5, there was no problem, and we could, just so we didn't get arrested, we could do what we wanted, and we wouldn't tell our parents what we did. Now people are afraid to let their kids out the front door because all these awful things are ready to, involve them in. So that because there was kind of a freedom, I would have adventures, when on the weekends and all summer, and as I did that with friends, it was one thing, and then I would do it by myself too. And when I'd go places by myself, I very early on felt this internalizing of an experience that I didn't internalize when I was with my friends. So that, I think, has very much influenced the way I work, but I didn't think about that at the time, of course. It was just an accumulation of an experience that then reinforms the way you think later. So I was very lucky to be born in this boring decade of the 50s when people didn't worry about you being kidnapped and whatever people worry about now, or the drug dealer giving you drugs, you know.
Especially since the solitary figures in your films are sometimes very scary. Like you talk often about like violence, could be serial killers, or it could be also like just political dissidents. But there is this idea of solitude linked to violence.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about landscape suicide is both of those characters that commit violence. One is a young girl who's isolated because of her class. She's in a family that's very poor in a very affluent community outside of Los Angeles. And then the Geen character is a person that lives by himself on a farm, isolated from the community of the small town that he lives near. And I don't think you can make a correlation between isolation and violence, but these two people, it brought out violence in them because of their isolation. So, I mean, I think if you read Thoreau, and I don't think he experienced violence when he was growing beans next to Walden Pond. But I think if you don't feel a part of a community, that can cause violence. And I think that's what Geen and Bernadette both witnessed, or had feelings of not fitting in and being belittled in a way.
Maybe could you talk a little bit about this is a huge chapter of your filmmaking and art in the 2010 when you switched to digital, is the whole project about the cabins of Thoreau and Ted Kaczynski, which you rebuilt. And I guess that also connects to the idea of solitude, because you like populated this cabin, which is with like lots of other lives. And
well, I lived in New York City from 1980 to 87 in Lower Manhattan when Tribeca was kind of a ghost town, and now it's an awful place to live, but it was kind of interesting then. And that was living in a big city was, that was a great experience, and it became a small town because I had friends that lived in that part of New York too, and we created a community within this huge, large community. And then when I moved from there, I moved to California, and I knew I didn't want to live in Los Angeles because I had lived in New York, and I didn't want to look for New York City and Los Angeles, and I didn't want to have that same kind of city experience. So I moved to a small town called Valverde of 1,000 people, and the town was started by black people in the 30s that couldn't go to Palm Springs, so they built their own resort town. So it was affluent blacks, which was mainly jazz musicians, a few people from Hollywood, but Hollywood didn't hire many black people in the 30s when this was built. And so I moved to that town, and by the time I moved there, it was no longer an affluent black resort community, but it was a very poor town with about a third black, third Mexican, and third poor white. So I had this experience within this small town, which was so much different than being in New York City. And then in the early 2000s, I bought a house up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And when I got there, it was a perfect house. It didn't need any work, but I didn't like the way it looked, so I tore it all apart and put it back together. And then when I was finished with that, this town was a town of 200 people, and I lived on the outskirts of it, so it was very isolated. And then I thought, well, what can I do there? And so I started to think about Thoreau and about solitude at that particular time. And after I remodeled this house, it took about 9 months. I started to paint then, because I thought, what can I do in this solitude? And I wanted to teach myself how to paint. So I started to copy paintings of artists that I like, and they were mostly outsider artists like Bill Traylor and Mose Tolliver, Henry Darger. And then after I painted for a while, I thought I kind of missed construction of fixing my house. So I thought, oh, I'll build another house. And then I thought, no, I'm too old to build a house. So then I thought, well, I'll build a small house. And then immediately I thought of Thoreau, because I was already thinking about outsiderness from doing these paintings. So I built a replica of Thoreau's cabin that he built at Walden Pond. And then I put some of my paintings into that cabin, and at that time I felt like, oh, I'm not just learning how to paint, and I'm not just building a house, but I'm constructing kind of a meaning to outsiderness and solitude. And so I looked at these paintings in the Thoreau cabin, and then I thought, well, it needed a counterpoint. It was too cute. And so then I thought, well, I'll find a counterpoint, and I immediately thought back to American Dreams, my film American Dreams. When I made that, the idea of that film was to collect all the baseball cards of Henry Aaron, and then I would film the fronts, and when you saw the fronts, you would hear a speech from the year that those cards were, and when I filmed the backs, you would hear some pop music from that year. And when I got to that point, I had the same feeling, oh, this is a good idea, but it's too cute. It needs a counterpoint. And that's when I decided to take the diary of Arthur Bremer, who was a person my age from Milwaukee that stalked Nixon, wanted to kill Nixon, and ended up shooting George Wallace. So you have this kind of anti-hero, and then I had the hero of Henry Aaron and those. And that seemed to make the film much better, that I had a juxtaposition of kind of a hierarchy of what I liked and what I didn't like. So then I thought I'd do the same thing with the cabin. It needed another cabin. And so at that point, I thought I'd build the Unabomber's cabin. It was Ted Kaczynski, who was a terrorist in the U.S. for 30-some years, ended up killing 3 people with letter bombs, and wrote a manifesto that was quite interesting because it was half crazy and half very sane. And when I built the Kaczynski cabin, I thought that I was building a bad guy and a good guy, just like Henry Aaron and Arthur Bremer from the American Dreams. But then as I did more research about Kaczynski and Thoreau, I could see that they crossed over, that Thoreau supported John Brown, who was a terrorist that led to the Civil War, and Kaczynski wrote much about the evils of technology, and it's the same stuff that Thoreau was writing about. So they kind of wove together. And then that really interested me with this 2 cabins piece. So I built the second cabin, did some more paintings, put it in there. And then that led to making 3 different films that came out of the 2 cabins project. So they exist too. which would be a film called Two Cabins, which is a half-hour film just looking out the windows for 15 minutes of each of the cabins, and then Stemple Pass, which is just about the Kaczynski, about Kaczynski in that cabin, and then I also did a piece that's called Nightfall, that was shot up in the mountains and just feeling the sky getting darker, and it's both things that Kaczynski and Thoreau would have thought about, light changing and the kind of solitude that led to that kind of investigation of space and time and things. So the Two Cabins project became very complicated, and it's the Two Cabins still exists, and I'm hoping somehow to get them to be maintained by some institution so that they could go on after I'm not here anymore, because I think it's a really valuable monument to solitude and to this kind of thinking that can go in two ways, that can lead to violence or it can lead to something else. Yeah.
It's also what's like you talked about it, but what's very important is the I hesitate to call it fakery, but like reproduction or copying.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what kind of exactitude you put in it. I remember when we did a retrospective at Jeu de Paume in 2009. I remember we went to the Palais Tokyo, and some artist, I don't remember who, but had reproduced Kaczynski's cabin. Mm-hmm. And I remember you watching the distance between each nail on the cabin and saying, "Oh, he got that wrong."
Well, it's funny because when I built the Thoreau cabin, I didn't build it with it's so exact because I didn't know this was going to be an art piece. It was a construction piece, and the actual shape and measurements of the building are exactly taken from Thoreau's cabin. But the materials that I used new designer kind of windows and things that are, because I wasn't replicating it. But then when I built the Kaczynski cabin, there's these great photographs by Richard Barnes that shows all four angles of them, and so I could replicate that cabin exactly by extrapolating the measurements from seeing the size of a piece of plywood, and I could do all the measurements, and so that cabin I built exact. I'd like to go back and redo the other one, but I don't think that's necessary because I like the narrative of that the cabin suggests that this one's perfectly a model and the other one isn't, and it's because of the way the artwork built itself as I went along, and the rules changed.
And also, when you talk about the two cabins, basically comparing or like putting aside Thoreau's and Kaczynski, you're already doing something that, I mean, participate to what you call spherical space, and now when you see like your body of work, there are so many films that relate to each other through a very distant period of time, and I was wondering, because it looks very conscious, and I was wondering if it grew up of your idea about spherical space that you built in particular films like 11 by 14, where maybe you could explain also what you meant by spherical space.
Well, I think the first time I really used that term was when I made One Way Boogie Woogie, which we're not showing here, right? If I'm
no, it's not.
And that film is a film with 61-minute shots, and and I one shot follows the next in film, so film is inherently linear, but I wanted to build cross-referencing from one shot to a shot further in the film and back, so that when you remembered the film, you wouldn't remember it necessarily linearly, but you would connect this and this and this, and it would kind of produce a spherical space rather than a linear space. And that whole idea came from watching Michael Snow's La Région Centrale, where he built an apparatus that could actually film a sphere. You know, the camera could take the positions of the outside of the sphere, looking inward and outward. And I kind of like that he built and the film itself is linear because that's the way film works. There's one frame after another, and it goes through the projector and in the same order every time. But the way that his camera moved around, it was surveying a space in a sphere. And then from that, I thought, oh, it's interesting to maybe have cross-referencing of things from here to here to here, so you don't remember the film literal in a line, but you remember it as a sphere, kind of. Yeah.
And did you think about that while like building up your own work? Like how, basically, I wonder how you start a film. Like, do you think about something you did in the past, or is it like how does it work? How does a new film appear? It could be. I wonder if you're driving somewhere.
I have ideas and they keep coming, you know, and sometimes they come directly out of the film before, and then they keep growing, and then sometimes I jump back to something. And so in a sense, my life is linear, but my thinking isn't linear. It jumps back and around. But for a while, you know, I can, like in the 90s, I did all these text films, so I did one kind of text film and another, that is text-image relationship films. And those kept changing by what I had already done, what haven't I done, and what else did I want to do with that. So that, I mean, in that kind of thinking, it's very logical going from here to here to here. But then there's these places where you take a break and go sideways and think about something completely different. But I can't say why that happens. It just
because there are lots of films that you almost like there are projects that you do around home, and there are projects that requires to like long drives. Are these projects always come from like an idea or a structure? I remember like Small Roads or El Cohen. For example, El Cohen, would you look for that eclipse, that particular place? Do you sometimes drive without knowing what to do?
El Cohen was, it's an interesting film because the eclipse was going to happen, you know, 8 hours from where I lived, or 6 hours. So there was a lot of stuff in the news. It's 3 months to that, it's 2 months, you know. And so I thought, oh, I'm going to go film it. And I didn't know what that meant, to film an eclipse. I know I didn't want to film the sun because there's so much footage of eclipse of the moon blocking off the sun. And so I just looked at a map and saw where the eclipse would travel across the U.S. And then I thought, oh, I'll go to a kind of a rural area, and the one that looked most suitable was in Oregon. So I drove up, and then I looked for a place that would be kind of not at all unspectacular, that it would be just some garbage here and some telephone post line that would give me a z-axis, and then a view of a mountain that's 30 miles away, so that way I could measure as the shadow of the moon comes across the landscape, and so once I found that, I've had to figure out how would I open the lens up when the shadow actually comes, because it jumps a number of stocks. But I thought all that technical stuff. But then when it was all over, the first thought I had was of Leonard. It was such a spectacular experience. It was magical because you have night come and it stays for 2 minutes and then it goes. And it came, and I could see it coming from 30 miles away, and as the shadow of the moon came towards me. And I thought, this is just remarkable. And then it went to night for 2 minutes, and then it was day again. And I thought, that's so spectacular. And I thought that I really like Leonard Cohen, and I thought he was always looking for that experience. He wanted to find something that had kind of pure meaning to it. And like he said, he studied Buddhism and all the religions and philosophies, but no matter how hard he tried, happiness always came through, which I thought was kind of interesting. But there was kind of a happiness that I had when I saw this, and I really thought this is what he was searching for, something so magnificent that's created by something that's here, and it's just magical, and it happens and it's gone, you know. So that's when I thought the title should be El Cohen, and I would use one of his songs.
But the song you used is like he's referring the light
About
coming
light.
through the window,
Yeah.
which also relates to the frame that we see the
And I
image.
purposely found that song to put in. Yeah. So it's literally connected to what just happened. Yeah. I'm not afraid to be literal from time to time.
I was wondering how well do you know the American roads? How much time do you spend on the roads? Or did you maybe slow down a little? Because you made a number of films where you actually cross the whole United States, be it on a motorcycle or...
Yeah. I circled the U.S. twice on cycle when I was making North on Evers. I circled the U.S. once for RR. I circled the U.S. 1.5 times when I made 13 Lakes. So I did a lot of driving, and I know I can kind of recognize every place now. I seem to know it. And I know California really well. And I also know Utah. When I made Deseret, I spent 3 years filming there. And I did every road in Utah to look because it's such an amazing state. So I do know, and I know the landscapes of all those places and the kind of feel that each landscape gives and how it affects me. And yeah.
Do you always remember what you felt filming, or do you remember it because you rewatched the?
Yeah, filming is always an anxiety. You know, that's what I mainly remember, waiting for something to happen. But it's more now about the times I'm not filming that are more important. Because filming, it just comes with a certain anxiety, especially when I was shooting film and it costs so much money.
No, it's
But I take time to feel the place before I shoot.
Or before you shoot. And that's also what you teach to your students at CalArts. How did that class started?
I just, well, first I wanted to get out of the school room because I think it's important to be outside of institutions, and there's a certain freedom that brings, but it was to confront students with experiences they've never had, and then for them to analyze those experiences aesthetically, politically, socially, so that you start to have a better sense of what your life is about by reacting to things that you see that you're confused by, and that by spending time, you learn a lot from. It's hard work to pay attention for a long period of time, but it's important to have that kind of commitment to what you're looking at and to try to understand it beyond the prejudice you bring to it.
Maybe we could open up the discussion to the audience. I don't know if anybody would like to ask something or have any reaction regarding what you've seen during the last days here. Est-ce que quelqu'un veut poser une question?
I was wondering if you could talk more about Breathless and if there was a particular experience of seeing the fire but experiencing people who are there not noticing it, and how do you think that this movie will change maybe if movies like this can change our relationship with nature and how we perceive it through a movie as opposed to how we see people not perceive it in reality? Let me know if that was clear.
I missed the first part. Were you referring to a particular film or
to Breathless?
On Breathless.
Yep.
I don't know if I haven't shown it enough to really understand how audiences will react to it. I kind of feel like I respond to the narrative so closely because I lived in that narrative, and then it seemed, when I experienced it, it seemed so close to me, so nearby. And then when you see it and sit in an audience, it seems like forever for the narrative to get to you. But for me, that was a very quick 87 minutes. And so I think it's a funny film. I don't know if it'll function the way I experienced it, but I'm interested in exactly that. And when I finished it, I thought, there's people are going to walk out on this film. It's just too difficult. And if I can beg you to stay till the end, maybe you won't even get what you need to get from it, because it's you have to pay such close attention to things. And then I know the context. I know where it is. I know what those jet planes are. I know why they're cutting that tree, because we had many forest fires there, and they're keeping the tree from growing next to these high tension wires that have caused forest fires before. So there's part of it that's kind of even hidden in the shot. And then how does it relate to Breathless at all? It's maybe, I don't know. I think if I saw the film, I'd think the filmmakers may be making fun of me, and I certainly don't want the audience to think of that. I'm kind of belittling my film now, but I don't have a sense of it yet as to how it will play. But I know other films of mine in the past were misread by audiences, and then later on they were read the way I intended them to be read. So I don't see it as an immediate failure, you know, if audiences don't respond to it the way I wish they did. Yeah. Does that get to what you're asking? Kind of.
In a way, yes. Can I ask another question? I was also just wondering if you had the question of whether you should call somebody for the fire as somebody who was there.
There was no fire here, but they're cutting this tree back so a fire wouldn't start. But that particular canyon, I've been living up there for 20 years. It's burned 4 times, so it's very vulnerable to fire there, both from careless campers and from lightning strikes.
Alors moi aussi j'ai vu Breathless hier et j'aime beaucoup. Vous avez dit au début que vous auriez préféré ne filmer que la lumière, enregistrer la lumière, et que vous regrettiez, c'est ce que j'ai compris, la narration qui intervenait dans le film sans que vous le vouliez. Alors moi je crois savoir la réponse, mais peut-être vous pouvez le dire. Pourquoi vous avez gardé cette narration? Pourquoi pas filmer le lendemain ou 1 heure après?
Well, one can plan something and then something else can happen that's much better than what you planned. So that's why I didn't come back and film it without the narrative. That's what excited me so much, that they did this thing in front of me and then they went behind some trees and did it again. And so I experienced the same thing twice, and the second time just through hearing it. And so it's kind of an amazing thing that happens, that I see exactly what they're doing. And I mean, I could have played the film backwards, where you hear it first and then you see what they're doing. That would be another thing that could happen. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised that a narrative appeared and then that narrative also for me almost made me feel like it was planned by Godard, because it was things he's interested in, So I'm trying to make fun of him and he makes fun of me, So yeah, shame on me.
I wanted to ask a little question also about Breathless, though I have some more questions about the United States of America. Maybe it was in discussion, there was a queue I couldn't enter earlier. How did you come to choose this exact place for Breathless? And what struck me during the screening, that the road goes directly to the mountain and there is a perspective that ends with a dead end. And for me, it was very important to the picturesque side of the film. And how did you come to choose this exact point of photography? And also the question about the United States of America, the newest film, the 2022, about the exact places. Probably this question already was then. I'm sorry for the audience. And thank you a lot again.
I had driven through there the day before, or 2 days before, and I had seen that tree that was very bright, and I thought I liked that as an image, and I thought it will probably change with the light, and I thought that would be a good thing to film. And I know that area, and I know the Kern River that's right next to it is very interesting. So there's stuff off screen that I like. So I'm familiar with it, and I had seen the bright leaves, so I thought that I'd come back 2 days later and film it. And then what was this?
I didn't get
the other by the U. What was it?
I didn't get the question about the USA.
Well, I know the U.S. fairly well, so I kind of have an idea of what I think each state looks like. And then I know California very well, and so I thought, this was shot during the pandemic, so it was difficult to travel at the time, and I didn't have the money or time to go to all the states, but I thought, it also is a time of a great amount of lying, fake news, and America is just leaders just telling one lie after another. So I thought, oh, this is a good time to make a film about lying. So that's one of the reasons I did it. But the other one was just a game for me to find a place in California that would represent that particular state. And if you know the states, and I think I've done actually pretty decent job of representing the states just from finding a place. When I lived in New York City, I had that idea that I would do a film about 10 or 15 different cities in the US, but I'd film them all in New York City, and I never made that film. But so I had that idea much earlier, like 20 years earlier. It's just a game, you know, and I didn't mean to fool anybody because I tell you in the end.
Hello. I find it interesting that you mentioned anxiety during filming, and I was wondering if this feeling is also related to finding the right duration of a shot, and like how do you decide to end the shot, and is it like a link to a logical decision, more a gut feeling, or like intuition? And also, I have a second question that, I mean, you mentioned a lot of author directors like Cassavetes, Godard, and who represent a certain directing style. But nowadays, I think like many people can call some style and aesthetic a Benning shot, just like James Benning's films, create a certain lineage between filmmakers or make an homage to your cinema. And do you think you can also find yourself in a position of an author, and how do you feel about that?
I'll answer the second one first. I've made many different kinds of films, but I do agree that if you see any of the style of films that I make, there's something, at least I feel like I made them when I see them. So I think that's true, and certainly I've made a lot of landscape films where I'm not afraid to make a frame, and to make a frame that has beauty or some power to it. So I feel very confident when I make those kinds of images. So I think that I have heard people say that, you know, that looks like a film of mine or whatever. So it is happening at this point. But I think after you make a lot of work, somehow you're going to be named one way or another, right? And then what was the first question? Was
question about anxiety. About anxiety and duration.
Yeah, I just I've made films that like RR is a good example of filming trains across the United States. And when I made that film, I purchased a map of railroads, and on that map, they would make the railroad on the map darker or lighter depending on how active it was. So if it was a really dark line for the railroad, you knew there were 25 trains a day or whatever. And if it was just kind of dotted, you would know there might be a train once a week. So because they have different frequencies on different tracks, immediately the anxiety level would go up or down depending on how they were registered on these maps that I had. And then sometimes there would be servicing of the tracks where they would be doing work, so there wouldn't be a train all day, even though it's supposed to be 20 trains a day. So that particular activity just induced anxiety. And then if I'm working with people, I just get anxious that I'm boring them when I'm asking them to do stuff. I'm not very good at working. I'm just anxious when that happens. But otherwise, I'm very calm. It's just, I don't know what happens, but I think maybe that's why I keep working. I like being anxious once in a while. makes you feel alive.
Hello. I have a question regarding readers, and maybe a little bit to what you just said with people and how you are working with them, and the way, and also likewise two sub questions like, are you in the room, and how are you technically doing what you're doing? Like, are you listening to it? Do you have the headphones on, I think, and do you look through the viewfinder or onto a...
Well, for both readers and which has 4 people reading, and 20 cigarettes, which has 20 different people smoking, both of those films, I would set the frame and I would tell the people where the frame was, and then I would just say, simply light the cigarette and smoke and let me know when you're finished. And then for readers, I said, you're going to read for a half hour, and I'll be back, and we'll turn off the camera at that time. So in both of those cases, I left the room so I wouldn't make them conscious of me watching them. I wanted them to maybe feel the anxiety of being alone, because both not readers so much, because readers, people would immediately get into the reading, but smoking, it's performative, and one of the interesting things I thought about 20 cigarettes was that everybody started with a certain amount of self-consciousness and a little bit of anxiety of being on a camera. But since the fastest smoker was 2.5 minutes, and the slowest, a couple of them were 11 minutes. But anywhere in between there, almost, I think all 20 people at some point relaxed and revealed their true selves. So I got a portrait at some moment within the smoking of the cigarette. I felt like I had a true portrait of the people that were smoking for me. And since I knew all of them quite well, most of the time I wasn't surprised, but a few of them surprised me when I thought they really revealed something beyond what I knew about them. So it was a very interesting experience to make both of those films.
Je vais poser ma question en français. Merci.
I can hear,
C'est parfait parce que c'est exactement de ça dont je voulais parler. C'est justement du rapport à l'humour dans les films de James Benning, parce que c'est quelque chose dont j'étais pas réellement conscient. Mais hier, en présentant 11x14, il parlait de ce film-là comme d'un film divertissant. Et c'est vrai que pendant la séance, en fait, les gens rigolaient. Et je me souviens aussi d'une scène dans One Way Boogie Woogie où un homme promène son chien et 27 ans plus tard, le même homme promène un cheval. Enfin, toutes ces choses-là, ces sortes de private jokes. Est-ce qu'il peut en parler? Est-ce qu'il fait ça consciemment? Voilà. Merci.
Yeah, I'm pretty funny. I generally can't pass up a joke, so I have to be careful that I don't do too much of that. When I finished One Way Boogie Woogie, I thought it was hilarious, and then after a few years, I thought, God, those are bad jokes, and now I like them again. So it's funny, but I'm not afraid of humor. I kind of like humor to be a jokester at times. I was kind of a class clown in school. So.
Is that also something that you would look for in art or in films? I know that you've talked about 11x14 about Tati, that I think David Bordwell showed you. Jacques Tati.
Oh, yeah.
Or you talked about what is the American art of that period, like maybe the funk art or Owen Land or that kind of... So, like, does humor also colors your taste?
Yeah, I like Playtime. Is that the name of the very much, and the kind of humor that happens, visual humor like that. Yeah, I don't know what more to say, but yeah, I'm glad you find some things funny because it's embarrassing when nobody laughs.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about the also connected to the aspect of duration of the presence in some places together with some images about the aspect. Maybe you might know that another Californian filmmaker, Nathaniel Dorsky, mentioned really often the aspect of duration that can impact the humans' feelings and humans' metabolism, actually. And have you ever thought about this aspect of this duration of this processing as something, as some therapy in a way, or some therapy like in a way to get an attempt to see the things and see them in a new way, like not only in political or aesthetical way, not only in a way we are opening the new places, but in a way of the whole experience that can bring something through this. Have you ever reflected it?
Like duration as therapy, or experience of duration.
Like more the spiritual aspect. Just like, yeah, devotional aspect, if you want. He has a book called Devotional Cinema.
I don't know how each person in the audience reacts to duration, but I think that almost at some point everybody gets confronted by it, and that somewhat interests me. And I mean, we live in a time of short attention spans, and especially with phones and all this kind of thing, that I think it's really important. One of the things that's important in my films is it slows you down, and hopefully it slows you down, and that you start to see that there's an importance to duration, that you can only feel some things through duration, and that duration itself varies. The time sitting in a dentist chair seems a lot longer than if you're having a hot fudge sundae somewhere. So that time is kind of an interesting quantity that we experience differently depending on what the situation is. So I'm very interested in confronting those kind of durational aspects of life.
Yeah, of course, that's why I mentioned about the space, because we are coming to the space, and here is another quality of the time, and that's where we are coming for another quality of the time, for the slowness. And I know you might know that in some countries like Japan exists the therapy with slow cinema. It exists. For example, this metropolis like Tokyo, Kyoto, they are using it. They're putting people in the special room, and there
they show you Time in Leon.
What?
And they show you Time in Leon.
Kind of Time in Leon, and like it because it was started in 2000s, and they mostly showing the films that titled slow cinema. So it's really like the way, and it's totally matched with what you do, but you do it in a different way. It's more, sometimes it's mathematician, but I have a question about small roads, actually, because I think that small roads, something, maybe 10 Skies too, though, but small roads has such a special feeling, I don't know, such as, maybe you have some special relation to this, more, I don't know, it just has special atmosphere that's quite different. If you are the pieces, can you talk about it, maybe? It's how I felt.
I suppose I agree with everything you say. I mean, the term slow cinema it's so insulting. This isn't any slower.
Nothing,
Time
no,
is
no.
the same.
Just
It's
time.
not
Yeah, it's just the time.
slow. It's long.
It's just the
It
name.
should be called long cinema.
Long cinema, yeah.
Too long cinema. Yeah. Yeah. What's boring?
Yeah.
But the
How
synapse.
do,
That's-
how, do you, how do you relate to the idea of boredom?
Well, if you're not interested in something, you can get bored, but that doesn't mean it's boring. It means you're not interested. And then you don't, I don't know, why not be interested? Yeah.
Maybe the last thing that.
Last question.
Yeah. As you said, for example, in readers or some films, you're like going out, you live in the people or something in front of the camera, and it creates different sense of feeling when you are watching. But it's sometimes hard to see how you're approaching the process of seeing while you're watching, because you definitely like since maybe like a lot of years you're not touching the camera, but as I see in like small roads, you see differently, like intense skies is different. Or I mean, do you divide your films on this kind of general look, like when you want to achieve something like not your look or something, or maybe some more personal or some more like, yeah, I know it's tiny things, but you still can feel it, you know.
Is there any way you can answer to?
I was going to say something and it just completely flew out of my mind. It was really important too, because you touched on something, but I must be getting old. It'll come back.
So maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions. Maybe there in the back.
I was just wondering about sound, like how do you work with sound, like, and so you work like from your first film till now. Did you change your method, your microphones, or your relationship to sound, or just some question?
I've changed. When I first started making films, I was really elated to be able to work with sound. And because you could have sound, I would put sound, and I would construct soundtracks. And the 11 by 14 is a good example of I try to put a lot, and Landscape Suicide too. I think the soundtracks are overproduced, and there's too much sound. I didn't understand how silence works and how varying sounds and low sounds work. And so in the last, like the United States of America 2012, those sound, they're very quiet and there's some very loud sounds, and I'm very much more in tune to building tracks that I feel are much more real than, and before they were more illustrative. But now I like really subtle art that you hardly hear things, and you just hear something slight. So I've changed my idea of sound, and I really like my newest films the best because of that. Now the Breathless, that's loud because that's what I found there. So that soundtrack isn't generally what I've been working with today. So I used the loud sounds of the chainsaw and the airplanes, and then you hear the very quiet off-screen sound of the river. So there's white noise that runs through that whole film. So it's kind of interesting because when it's quiet, it's white noise, and then it's interrupted by these kind of loud, abusive sounds of chainsaws and jet planes, truck. But yeah, but I think I'm much more subtle with sound now than ever.
You referred before some of your films to them as very highly structured, and I was wondering maybe you can talk a little more about structure, because for me they all feel kind of really structured, but at the same time there's a lot of intuition in it, I think. Yeah. And maybe you have to say something about the decision between the two poles.
I make a number of films that I've made. The structure is predetermined. The idea of finding 20 people to smoke cigarettes, so I know. And then it just becomes an ordering, who do I put where. I like to preconceive the whole film before I even shoot. And then I just fill in the boxes. I really know the overall structure. But that doesn't mean I might completely change something or make a change that interrupts the structure that I first designed. But I think it comes out of from when I was making film and I had little money that I couldn't. I had to be really prepared. So I've thought these strong structures that tell me what the film is going to look like before saves me a lot of money. So, and then I know when that shot's done, that hole is finished, and when this shot's done, this is finished. But because of that, I think the structures become very strong because they're regulated from the very beginning. The problem is you don't want them to become kind of a gimmick of when it's so simplistic, that there should be some kind of interruption in either what happens in one of the sequences or whatnot. Trying to think of films that were Deseret is an interesting film because it's a film about the state of Utah, and I found 94 articles in the New York Times from the date the Times began in 1853 till when the film was being made in the early 1990s. And then I was able to, I had a person read all those stories. And then the structure of the film was to cut one shot for every sentence of a story. And then the rule was that within any one story, there'd be at least one shot that was literal to the story, but the other ones could be anywhere else in Utah. And then because of the way language, our journalistic language developed in America, early on, the sentences are longer, and then as you get as it gets closer and closer to 1990, the sentence gets more terse. They get shorter and shorter and shorter. So the film is automatically sped up by the speeding up of language, and I found that to be a really interesting structure for a film that's determined by a changing structure in language. So I'm interested in those kinds of plays with structure.
RR is also really interesting in terms of like a structure that is sort of organically changing because of the content of the shots.
Yeah, RR is trains that come into a frame and leave the frame. So depending on the length of the train and its speed, I'm collaborating with the subject as to how long the shot length would be. And that same idea was then taken again in 20 Cigarettes, where I'm collaborating with the smoker or how long it takes to smoke a cigarette would determine the length of the shot. So there's our structures that I set up that are controlled by the subject itself.
Une question de devant.
Hello. I saw you made a film in La Ruhr in Germany, shooting in industry, which is relating to what you said before. Seems very different than shooting natural event or forest. And I wanted to ask you if you thought about the difference of filming a machine making something repetitive, like industry, like in the industrial work, and the difference between that and filming, for example, skies, clouds evaluating into the sky, which is a totally different relation to time due to the object. And in industry, there's time, but it's I don't know. I didn't see La Ruhr, but I just saw some shots on internet, and I thought, oh, it's strange that it looks.
Yeah, well, Ruhr certainly deals with industrial time. The second half of the film is an hour long, and it's documenting the remnants of coke being made. Coke is is heated coal that's compressed, and then it turns into coke that's produces a super heat that's necessary to make steel, to melt iron ore into pig iron. And the process itself is, where I filmed, had 24 ovens, and every 15 minutes they would push one of the ovens out, and it would go into a railroad car, and then the railroad car would be driven underneath the cooling tower, and they'd pour 30,000 gallons of cold water onto it, and the coal would shoot up the cooling tower, and all the steam would come out. And if the process is running accurately, one happens every like 12 minutes that this happens. And when I filmed for an hour, so you see a number of those, and somewhere in the middle of the process, one of the things being pushed out, one of the pushes was delayed by 15 minutes. So I was waiting for this very regulated steam that would come out of the tower that should happen every 12 minutes, and then there was, in the middle, which I really liked, there was a processing error that caused that one of those iterations to be skipped. So you're waiting for the smoke, and then it doesn't happen. And I was shooting that at dusk, so I'm very aware of the sun going down too. So we have the light changing from a sunset, and then it's being regulated by this, which should have been every 12 minutes smoke coming out. So I constructed shots like that completely deal with the actual time of the industrial process, and how that, in this particular case, you'd get these sculptural smoke that would happen at a particular rate.
Just to continue on that subject, because I saw the film Ruhr for the first time, and for your information, only one person left, and it was pretty full. I was really surprised because of that. That's a long shot.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to tell you what I went through, because it interested me, because I went through the chimneys during Germany's nasty period, all those chimneys that were smoking away. And then I went to the Koch brothers, who are the millionaires who are financing our favorite person in the United States. And then I went to Kubrick's film, The Obelisk. Then I went to Dante's Inferno, as it was getting darker. And then I said to myself, I'm never going to be able, I went to a Buñuel film. I said, I'm never going to get out of here. It's just going to, because it seemed to be so eternal. And my question is, do they go at night as well? Is something eternal about them, or do they turn off
the steel process runs 24 hours a day, so they need coke 24 hours a day. And there's 2 cooling towers in case one slows down, they'd switch over to the other one. And there's, I think there's 48 ovens that are going day and night. So
I did curse you.
Yeah.
I did curse Mr. James Benning at a moment in time, but then I came out of it, and I forgave you. It was a really very interesting sequence. Thank you.
I have a question toward the usage of text, because you mentioned that you were highly interested in it in the 90s. And can you hear me loudly?
I didn't hear what were
the text. You had a period of using texts and working a lot with it. And I saw Four Corners, and I really admire the way you make up such a bigger picture by like knitting these texts into each other. And then I saw Sample Pass, and then it's quite a long time later, but you still decided you want to use these texts. And which passages do you use, and what did you learn from like your 90s period, and how did it change towards using text again now, or not that far long ago?
Well, then in the 90s, I really spent a whole decade working with text. The very first one was Deseret, where I looked up all these articles about Mormons in the New York Times, and which was very interesting because the Times was 2,000 miles away from Utah, and they really didn't like the kind of things that the Mormons were doing, and it was a territory at that time. And then in 1896 it becomes a state, and so the first half of that film is New York Times articles about how corrupt the Mormons are, and then once it becomes a state, then it's about how Utah becomes a right-wing model for America. So there's this kind of certain prejudice from the East Coast that is more than likely accurate most of the times, but it's also kind of prejudice they had. So I was really interested in using text and then cutting images to that particular text. And then what did I make after that? Deseret was then, and then let's see.
North on Evers?
North on Evers, and that was a diary that I wrote, and I guess that was first, right before. It's a diary that I wrote to a friend in 1989 when I did a motorcycle trip around America. And then the next year I decided to make the same trip around and look for the people and places that I mentioned in this diary. And so I went on my motorcycle again, and I did shots of the people and places that I visited. And then I wrote a handwritten text that's of that diary from the year before. So it's talking about 1989, but you're seeing the same people in 1990. So it might say, oh, my good friend was trying to have a baby and she can't get pregnant. And then you see her with a baby. So she does get pregnant. So there's this kind of, and then I also made the text through the frame a little bit before you see the image. So what you read, you then will see, but you're seeing it from a year later, so it seems like it's only a few minutes out of sync, but it's really a year out of sync. So I was kind of playing with text and time in that piece, and then Four Corners was next, which showed here, which I wrote these particular biographies of 4 painters, and then I wrote these histories of the 4 different places, and then kind of illustrated those texts through paintings and through landscapes. So and then the last one was I stole the text from Richard Dindo's film Che Guevara, the Diary of Che Guevara, and then I reshot images for his soundtrack. So it didn't take place in Bolivia, but it took place in Southern California. So I was playing with language and place in that particular film. Was there another question? But I tried many different image text experiments in the 90s.
Yesterday you mentioned a few remakes. You mentioned remakes, that you made a remake of Easy Rider and this remake of Breathless, but also you're remaking your own films. And I was wondering, what relation you had with this idea of remaking, exactly what you said, like you make a road trip and then you remake it the next year. So I'm interested in this idea and how you relate to that.
Yeah. Well, I think as I worked as an artist, my ideas would kind of flow like a river and I'd go from here to here to here, but then you'd get to a point where something here would relate to something I did earlier. So then I would think, okay, this actually connects with something earlier, so I might jump back to that. And then I might even remake something of my own work because this made me think of that. So that at first I thought of time as linear and going like this, and that my ideas would grow like that, but then I realized that ideas kind of circle back on top of each other, and I found it interesting to revisit particular ideas with now a different point of view than from when I did it the first time I was coming from here. Now I learned this much more and I circle back to that. And there's a certain amount of play in that to rework, to redo things, and not to cancel out what you did before, but to try to make something new that'll make you relate to that older work differently. So there's a bridge that's built.
S'il n'y a pas de dernière question, juste vous dire qu'il reste 2 jours dans cette rétrospective. Vous pouvez encore voir American Dreams, Lost and Found et John Krieg exiting the Folk Corporation in 1971, as well as 13 Lakes and 2 Moons and Sam, which is, I think, playing tomorrow. So it's not over yet. But for now, thank you so much, James.
Thank
for
you.
Generosity. Thank you, everyone.
You're inspiring me. Thank you.